art direction for me is more about the emotions of design. It's about how should someone feel when looking at it. What are those emotional states that you're trying to convey to people, and how visually do you execute on that to create those emotional states? It's not something that's innate in me. That level of thinking, I think it is a bit more abstract initially, and it's got elements of psychology.
You're listening to Inside Commerce, a weekly e-commerce strategy, technology and CX focused podcast hosted by experienced digital consultants and re-platform specialist James Gurd and Paul Rogers. Get insights into e-commerce strategy of leading brands, hear from industry thought leaders and leading tech vendors with practical advice to help you improve your online CX.
This episode is sponsored by Shopify. Today it's just Paul and myself, so we don't need to do any introductions. And we are drilling down into what does good web design for e-commerce look like. And the reason for this is, a lot of you listening, myself and Paul, we're involved in lots of different projects, whether it is re-platforming, in which design is a fundamental part, or it's a brand relaunch or a refresh of an existing site. And design is a fundamental element of everything, from branding to functional elements. And design can be approached very structurally or objectively, or approached very subjectively. And what we want to pull up is, how do you define good design? And then look at some examples. So doing something a little bit different. For those of you watching on the video, we're doing screen share, and we're going to talk through a few sites as we go through to help provide a little bit of context for that. So let's start with both our definitions, right? So let's start with you, Paul. If somebody says to you in a room, new client, what does good web design mean? How would you articulate it?
So I think, so I've got quite strong views on this. And even your LinkedIn post, I thought, would kind of trigger some of those views. So I think, one, there's no such thing as good design. I think. Two, I think a lot of people look at, good design as a highly usable, quick to convert, very simple, intuitive experience. And I completely agree that's important, but I think it's a lot of what I think makes a good design project is how you kind of optimize towards your traffic. So I think if you're a multi-brand site, or, for whatever reason, all of the demand or the traffic coming to the site is kind of bottom of funnel and they're looking to check out as quickly as possible, I think great. Whereas I think if you're a brand and, your mandate is to, create brand awareness, drive top of funnel awareness, and ultimately appeal to like net new low intent audiences, I personally think you need to be thinking more about how you present the brand, photography, art direction, like content in general. And I think one of the big things that we've been focused on with a lot of our clients over the last few months and going into next year is more about that. And it's like, there's two sides to it. There's global design. And yeah, I guess if you've got one approach, how you design for both of those audiences. The other side to it is then personalization and segmentation, and where that falls into this. And like, you have your net new user landing pages, and then you maybe start to adapt the PDPs so that you've got the bottom of funnel, usable, hyper, fast, primarily focusing on the information around the transaction versus the kind of prioritizing some of the content that's going to better elevate the brand or the product, etc. So you got that. And then I think the only other thing, so I'm really going on here because I think you asked me quite a simple question. But I think the only other thing that's really interesting around this area that I think I often have a lot of friction with, and we also now kind of have CRO, and I've historically really had like strong views against a lot of the CRO stuff. Because I think quite often the KPIs are an issue. So you're kind of like, you're investing all this money in, or like in my opinion, you should be investing all this money in design and everything else. And then the only KPI you're looking at is conversion rate, which ultimately comes down to your traffic mix. And, if 70% of your traffic's bottom of funnel, you're going to have a great conversion rate. Whereas, a higher proportion of traffic is top of funnel. Like, you kind of need to be looking at almost non-transactional metrics, and obviously you kind of want everything to come back to revenue, but yeah, I think we can talk about all of this, but yeah, very interesting topic that's quite close to my heart.
Well, what I love is you started by saying there's no such thing as good web design, and then continued to explain what good web design was. So you've done well as a start.
I think it differs there, doesn't it? The other thing is the type of customer, the type of product. Yeah.
But this is what I'm trying to get us towards is I personally do believe there's such a thing as good web design, but it's not uniform, because this is the whole point is the brand and therefore the art direction, the customers and therefore the customer needs and what customers respond to. And that is across visual aesthetics, it's across tonality, style of content, length of content. And you're right, at different parts of the site as well. Some parts of the site are purely about education and information, like category landing pages is a great example of that, where you get a lot of people coming in, they're not down in the bottom of the funnel yet. They haven't got to understanding which part of the category they really need to shop through, or what price point or what brand within a multi-brand. Whereas on a PDP, you know full well that there is a much stronger purchase intent. Therefore, it's functionally more, it's functionally clear about what you need to do. But equally, some people can come into a PDP who don't know the brand, and therefore you need some additional content come back to a personalization thing. So I think there are some principles we can follow. What I found interesting, a couple of people, I think it was Andy Jackson from Studio Rotate, who shared on my post about, he's saying that he always goes back to Dieter Rams' definition as a benchmark, which is good design is innovative, makes a product useful, it's aesthetic, makes the product understandable, unobtrusive, honest, long-lasting, down to the last detail, environmentally friendly, and it's as little design as possible. And I think those are really good benchmarks. And we're going to touch on some of those because some of that is visual, some of that is functional, and some of that is I guess, systemic and operational. But, so let's move on and let's talk about, because break down design. In order to execute good design, you've got to go through a design discovery process, which could be a matter of weeks. It could be sometimes it's really long. It's over a month's period of intense amounts of research data in customer insight gathering. We don't want to spend an hour talking this to people because people fall asleep. But what are the techniques and principles that, in your experience, make a design discovery process effective?
So I think this is really interesting because I think obviously we talk a lot about change management. And I think a big part of design discovery for me is people, and it's managing opinions, and it's kind of prioritizing, and it's kind of balancing inputs. So I think you've got Oka on this list, which is a client we worked with. And I think one of the challenges that we had going into that project, where a redesign, was one of the big drivers for the business case, was that there was quite a lot of different types of stakeholders with kind of strong views. And essentially the product team wanted to deliver a replatforming project but elevate the brand. Whereas, the kind of marketing and brand inputs were way more focused on bigger conversations, I guess. So there was kind of a bit of push and pull. So in that scenario, I think the design discovery, part of it was, trying to collect the right inputs early from those kind of brand and marketing stakeholders. So understanding from a marketing brand feel, like you say, kind of tonality, all of that, just collecting all of that. And then basically trying to also build the foundations for the functional kind of overall UX, and some complex journeys in here, like the kind of modular sofas, few other areas, kind of cushion bundling, all of that kind of stuff. So we kind of got those two things, and then it was a case of trying to basically take all that, condense it down along with kind of our inputs, and then almost present back to the group a view, and kind of basically a view of the priorities, the most important things to get across by template and by customer segment, kind of how we could best use the content. And we essentially ended up with a spec with agreed examples per area. And then we'd almost kind of built a vision of all of the experience, and and then we went out to the agency, which is Bao, and they then fleshed it out based on that pretty detailed spec. But to be honest, the reason why I think this is interesting is because I don't think that's always necessary. I think that is more about the people that are involved in the project and how you manage the politics or different stakeholders or different goals. So it was a semi-political thing, but I think it ended up being a really nice process. But I think, this is a really interesting, again, I do think we could go on about this for hours, because I think there's probably certain brands where the best design discovery is just a very, very creative person, just like, doing things with very little process and documentation, being super creative and just taking like fundamental parts of the site or fundamental parts of the brand and just like being really creative. And then there's others like the project you're working on at a minute, which is similar to Oka, where there's a bit more complexity around like the journeys and everything else. So this is a really difficult one, because there is essentially I almost feel like there's no right answer. You've just kind of got, and I think you've got a lot of background in de-risking change and all of this. So I think you've got the governance angle to it as well.
What do Mattel, Victoria Beckham, Sennheiser, and Glossier all have in common? They power their businesses with Shopify. Shopify is the most innovative and scaled commerce platform on the planet. It also happens to have the best converting checkout on the planet. Shopify, powering the future of enterprise commerce. Find out more at shopify.com/enterprise.
You mean I'm the dull person to your creative mastermind, is what you're trying to say?
I definitely know I'm the creative master. I think, I think it's more that you probably bring more structure, and I think you probably bring an angle that I'm not as.
Well, I think in the creative and design discovery part of an overall discovery project, you have to have a bit of unstructured thinking in there as well. You cannot structure every part of creativity, otherwise it's not creative. But you need to have a structure to the process to know what your outputs are and how you get there in a succinct manner. Because the problem is, I guess, without any milestones, you end up going off on tangents. And I think, so what you've touched on for me makes perfect sense, is there are a lot of abstracts you start off with. And the critical bit for me is answering the question of, when someone says we want to be innovative or we want to elevate the brand, is I want to know what that means. What does elevate mean? Is it just about the site feels flat and non-interactive and there's poor transitions and it just feels like a catalog site, and we actually are we are an inspirational design-led business, and therefore that's what the look of it is? Or is it that, do you know what, walk into our store and you feel the experience and you feel the design and the creativity in the store, and walking through the store feels like a journey, whereas on site it feels like a functional product selling mechanism, and that's what we want to change. I think you have to lock it down to something specific and tangible, and then on the back of that, coming back to your point, you go, show us your top 4 or 5 sites that achieve this, and from your experience, how are they achieving it? I think once you've got those, you take the abstract and turn it to something tangible. I think then you're in a stronger place.
Yeah. I think something that's quite interesting about this episode so far, I think if we recorded this 3 years ago, we would have focused almost entirely on usability, UX, like kind of how the fundamental, like I feel like now there is like almost like a default approach to PLP, PDP and checkout. And there's like almost like a core template that is applied as like a default. And I think that now what we're talking about is actually where historically I think we would have been like, both of us probably would have played the role of like governing the UX and usability side, making sure that, the site is performant. Whereas now I think because it's, I guess, more competitive, because of the way marketing's gone as well, it feels like we're both actually kind of advocating. So you're on the JW Anderson site now, which is new. I think probably 75% of the industry would absolutely rip this to shreds. I love it. And I think it really like resonates with their customer and their brand. But I think it's just interesting that we're doing this episode. And I reckon if you went back to the start of, even when we started the podcast, we probably would have come at this from a different angle. And I think the industry's changed a bit now, and you kind of have to stand out. And you have to be thinking more about, brand, than you might have done historically.
I agree. And I think this comes back to the wider industry understanding that in ecom we've focused too much on middle to bottom of funnel and conversion, and less on the top of funnel. And actually, unless you are somebody who's just selling commoditized items where it is just a transactional purpose, and people are going to buy, and they're going to buy normally on the place that's got the best price at the time they want to buy and can deliver it when they want to deliver it. If you're a brand and you're building an audience and you're building customer loyalty and like ongoing, repeat customers, you have to educate people and buy people into the benefits of shopping with you, especially when you are a higher price point than like the mass market. So I think there's that fundamental understanding, therefore design plays a role. And it plays a role not just in the overall site, but it plays a role in terms of how you execute content within even transactional pages like PLPs and PDPs. The style of that content and how well it brings people in and it communicates campaigns, promotions, etc. is important. Which leads me on to my next question. It's the role of art direction. And I've worked on a few, you've worked on a lot more like high-end premium brands than I have, but I've worked with a few over the years in jewelry, fashion, beauty, skincare. And the degree to which art direction is an internal expertise varies massively. So a jewelry company where they had an entire art direction team of like 3 different people involved, and they came from high-end like publishing and creative roles into determining like the art direction for every single facet of content created, and very, very specific rules and guidelines about what was and wasn't permissible, through to we leave it to an agency to come up with a creative treatment that we review and say we like or don't. So I'm not asking the question about how do you determine what you need, but what is the role of art direction and what value does it add?
I mean, I think that this is kind of essentially how you present your brand and your product artistically, and it's the identity for me of like the brand. I think this is a really interesting one because I think this is the bit that often gets overlooked. And it's interesting because, like you say, a lot of brands have internal people that would, even if they're not art directors, they would kind of own creative direction for the business, so they would play that role. And I think where a lot of sites fall down is where you either have, we obviously know a lot of agencies, I think, that have this level of creative thinking that also build websites like Bow, LimeSharp, Greban, plenty of others. But I think that often where you kind of got that internal team and then you've got a dev agency, I think often that's where you start to get the more kind of flat traditional approach where art direction isn't really up for grabs, or they're kind of taking a set of brand guidelines and then they're applying kind of traditional design best practices or like UX best practices. Whereas I think the best sites, and one of the ones that I've worked on that I think is interesting, so the Frankie shop is one of our longest serving clients. I don't think Laura will mind me saying this, the site's not new now. I don't love the site overall anymore, but I love the brand. Like, their content is incredible, their photography is like amazing. And I think the first priority going into that project, which is really refreshing, is like, how do we best present the brand? How do we best get the most out of our content? How do we set the foundations for the team to create the best content? How do we become, web first with some of that stuff? And I think, photography is often the biggest part of this. But to me, I think, and to be honest, the Frankie shop, online is their primary channel. I personally think this is what makes the brand. They're a very visual brand. Yeah, and I think, the best brands will put this at the forefront of the project. But yeah, the role of art direction for me is like, it's the content, it's the brand elements, and it's kind of the bits that make you feel about a design versus the function.
Yeah, I agree. And I think sometimes it's conflated with like brand guidelines, and brand guidelines are distinct, but they flow out of art direction. And brand guidelines are critical because you've got to know about, uses of fonts, like color palettes, all those things that create consistency. But art direction for me is more about the emotions of design. It's about how should someone feel when looking at it? What are those kind of like emotional states that you're trying to convey to people, and how visually do you execute on that to create those emotional states? So it's not something that's innate in me. I respond to it visually, but that level of thinking, I think it is a bit more abstract initially, and it's got elements of psychology and it's got behavioral elements in it, and it's relevant to certain businesses and not others. So let's come on to it. So we talked about a few examples, and for those watching the video, you'll see these sites in the background. You see how very different they are visually. And now let's come on to like interaction design. We're getting to some more functional and fundamental elements, because e-commerce doesn't sit in just a design bubble. It's there to sell as well. There has to be functional coherence in there. So we're going to look at interaction design, nailing the aesthetics for coherence, and like functional coherence. So making sure that the functional ability of the site is coherent with the design. So you can introduce something amazing, but it's an arse to use, or it doesn't work properly with mobile, or on particular interactions, it causes issues on the screen and makes it difficult for shoppers to use it. So let's talk about interaction design. And I'm going to come back to the Oak one. I know you guys worked on it. I'm using it in the current project I'm working on with a furniture brand. And no site is 100% perfect. We all know that, and there's always a chance for improvement. What I like about this is that there are lots of sites that use transitions to create a like feeling of interaction on the page, and like you're part of that story. But often it's quite jarring. It will be blocks of content that's suddenly a transition and no more transition, and it doesn't feel like it flows to the page. And for me, the ultimate design comes in. It was there was a quote from Anton, who's a CEO at Greben, who's got a lot of amazing. I mean, they're renowned for doing quite beautiful sites, including the Sandquist one I got up here. He said, a design concept we use is digital salesman replication, which is about how well a site helps the customer in the way the best in-store salesperson would. Do we ask the right questions, guide people to the right place, give the right suggestions? Great salesperson can have an outsized impact on sales, and the same applies online, but available 24/7 through UX. So I think it's a lovely way of framing it. And what I like about it, if we take the homepage, there's movement and there's simplicity. There's not an overburdening of content on top of it. You're not detracting from it, but actually there's simple font changes to help you focus on where you should look. There's some nice interactions, standard ones, that's a standard interaction, but it's things like these additional elements coming in where you've got this added functionality using known patterns like slide out draw so you don't click people away. You've got these nice little transitions and highlights across different text links. So, I mean, this one where you've got like 5 different elements, it's been done to death in things like tabs, but this treatment is visually more engaging and more impactful. And it's a nice mix between like video, text content, like bold headlines, really bold product imagery, and things like this, which I like, where you have a premium brand focusing on the product, but having really soft interactions to then lay over like product information rather than having that straight from the beginning, which is a bit more visually crowded. And then little things like animations of text, like change in different colors as you come through. So it just feels like that to me is the example of how you build a coherence in that visual journey, but you're still fundamentally an e-commerce site promoting product.
Completely agree. And I think I have to say with this project, so by association only delivered work, they did the kind of design, they took what we put together. And I think this to me is, they're very strong in this area. I think if you look at all of the kind of themes they built, they're really strong on kind of consistent kind of usage of animation and transitions. We're kind of creating that kind of engaging experience. But yeah, completely agree. I think one thing that you said at the start that I've had a lot of conversations around recently. So as you say, Anton is like a real voice for a lot of this stuff in the industry. Greben very, very strong end-to-end on creative. And I'd say Ed, who we both know, is the other one that I've spoken to about this a lot. But I think we've got so many brands, because you used the words, essentially what I think that quote was saying was like, you've got your flagship store and you're kind of trying to create the same flagship experience for web. I think one of the most frustrating conversations I have with clients, or not conversations, more situations, is we've got brands that will spend upwards of £1 million building or refitting a store, but yet they won't invest 100k as a 40-50 million pound retailer in a design project when the kind of overall direction of the site hasn't been looked at for like 4 or 5 years. And I think, I find that like a really annoying thing in our industry, where I guess it's because that you can't really add tangible, maybe it's hard to add tangible KPIs to design work versus in-store I guess it's also like, is a shop front, but I just think people overlook this area so much, like especially premium brands.
Yeah, I think that the problem for me lies in that people want to measure the impact of investment, which is fundamentally should. And end of the day, if you're a head of or a director or a C-suite or an investor, you want to know that spending money is having a benefit. Now, that benefit might not be financial. It might be in other ways. I don't know how else you might measure it, but typically in e-commerce, right, we're talking about revenue measures. So coming back to your point at the beginning, you've got to nail down your KPIs. The issue with doing a replatform where you're migrating to a new tech stack and you're doing a complete and utter brand redesign is when you land there and the metrics change is what's driven it. How much of it is the tech or functional changes? How much of it is the design, treatment? And can you therefore attribute a incremental benefits to that investment? Splitting the two out, and I know you don't, I know often people take the replatform as a time to do it all in one, but
yeah,
I often find a couple of phases, which is get the tech first, because to me, fundamentally, if you're changing technology, it's a tech project. Fix known issues with user journeys and outdated design stuff, that's fine, but don't fundamentally engineer the design players and do that as a phase two, because then you've got far easier way to measure and validate that it's having an impact. I know not everyone agrees with that approach. So
I was going to say, I think we could debate this quite a lot, but the thing is, I think it depends. I think I agree with both arguments. I think I've had some very annoying situations where someone's replatformed, like their approach to tracking has changed, like fundamentally they've changed the structure of the site, their catalogs changed, the markets they're able to fulfill to have changed, and then, trade has dropped and they're like, it's the redesign. So I completely agree. It's annoying and it's much easier to measure if you do them separately. But I think I also have another frustration at the moment with the industry, in that there's so many replatforming projects at the minute where it's a nice brand. There's a huge amount of opportunity with the scope of the project. And instead of treating it as an opportunity to achieve a huge amount of work in a very efficient way, because it's the only time you're ever going to get that, everyone focused delivering a CapEx project in a certain way. And then they'll do 100K project. They will, just lift and shift or like base beam. And then they'll be like, we'll come back to redesign. And then they never come back to redesign. So I think there's the efficiency argument, but obviously it affects the project, adds risk, requires more time, everything else. And then there's your argument, which I do completely agree with. And I have been personally impacted by a number of times where, the KPIs are hard to measure. I think that's it's kind of, what's it, like chicken and egg, or, I think it's hard to measure.
There's no right answer. And this is why we work in a nuanced environment, right? I think the most important thing is appetite for risk. And you get a sense when you're working with clients about how risk averse versus how willing they are to just leap into something different. And when you have a risk averse business, trying to change everything at once normally ends up in chaos. It's very hard to manage and keep people on track. I'm very much a fan of, unless there is a fundamental need to redo it all. Like if your user journeys are wrong, that the data and the insights tell you fundamentally got the wrong user journeys. Like the creative assets are completely wrong. Everything about it is wrong and outdated. Then fine, that's a reinvention. Yeah. But actually, if it's just, do you know what? Some of the user journeys aren't quite right, and our product photography is poor, and we don't have enough shots, and our lifestyle imagery isn't engaging it. Then that's not a reinvention. That's more about I guess what you said earlier. I don't know what you call it, elevation.
Yeah.
And I think So I like to think initially more elevate rather than completely renovate.
I think this is where you and I are completely different as well. And we haven't actually talked that much about this since we started the project, but I think in general, I think my appetite for risk is very high. And my ideal approach to a project is, I guess, you either do as much as possible to maximize the value, or I guess you get it done as quickly as possible to realize the value to go into something else. Whereas I guess this is why, you've obviously come from really big projects, and you're more how do we de-risk? How do we structure the project properly? But I think that's why we probably work quite well together as well, to extreme.
You have to have contrasting approaches in order to come up with the right and there's normally an in-between in terms of you don't want to be 100% risk averse because you don't change anything and you replicate inefficiency. And I see that in non-design areas like functional areas where I say, oh, this is how we do it, but that's not the right way of doing it. I'm having lots of conversations around that at the moment, especially things like product data, for example. But the next point on this is around functional coherence, because it's all well and good to come up with something that's creative, that's visually beautiful, but it's got to be able to work functionally within the constructs of how people discover products, buy products, etc. on the website. And a couple of interesting quotes I thought from my post was basically, as a customer, functional accuracy is number one for me. So that's Hannah Spicer, who's a Klaviyo consultant for premium brands. We've got Will Lock, who's a global digital director at Noble Panacea, saying, for ecom, I tend to fall back on two words, findability, shoppability. That sums it up for me. So the need to ensure that the functional elements are factored in design. And the example I've gotten here, I think is really nice, is from Opoly. And this to me is where you have really, really nice creative design execution, but you haven't fundamentally changed anything from how people expect functional elements to work on the side. So this is for one of the the looks occasions, the fact that they're basically, it feels like the video is playing across the products and they're interacting with each other, all done in one shoot basically, but then cut up into different product videos. But it's still exactly the same. Instead of the standard interaction where I go over the product and it overlays a new one, I've now got a bit more playful, fun video. And there are amazing cost efficiencies in doing things like this as well, because you're not having to create multiple videos. You're taking one and just splicing it.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is interesting. So those 3 quotes, I think I half agree with them. And I completely agree with all your points on Opoly. And I think essentially intuitive experience is a non-negotiable, like in terms of someone being able to, function very easily, flow through a process, and kind of intuitively know how to purchase. I think that's critical. You can't, that's a non-negotiable. But I think for me, even the wording here, and Hannah I'm a huge fan of Hannah. We work with her all the time. She's excellent at CRM. But I think as a customer, functional is number one. I hear a lot of agencies say that kind of stuff, and I do agree. But I think you're not building, in most instances, you're not building for the customer, because the customer already knows the product. The customer already knows the brand. And as I guess when you're at that point where you are a customer and you're going to transact, you transacted before, I think function is everything. But I personally think nowadays, particularly with, the proportion of traffic to the brands that we work with that's coming from top of funnel brand awareness activity, whether that's from a social perspective, which it usually is mainly, or out of home or connected TV or, influencer marketing, whatever else, these people have zero intent. And I think, content is more important personally, a lot of the time. But I think again, it's so hard to measure. And I think the other thing that I was going to moan about is the degrading of tools for measuring behavior on site. If there was an accessible content square that's, providing digestible information around how people are using websites, I think it'd be way easier to kind of measure some of this stuff. But yeah, I think maybe I've been brainwashed as well because of the type of brand we work with. But doing my devil's advocate, as I like to, I think that the two are completely related, because yes, you have to have a page that if I'm coming from, I'm in discovery mode, I've seen a social post, pick your social channel, Insta, for example, and it's like a visually compelling post that's got me excited, whether it's about whether it's like a campaign angle, could be like environmental one, because I want to buy from environmentally conscious brands like Patagonia, for example, or Passenger, and I might have bought into a concept, but when I get there, I need to be now teased further into what's important about this, where do I go and how do I contribute, and what are the products and why should I consider this? Or it could be, I've seen something that just looks beautiful and it looks cool and I want to find out more about it. Or it could be a technical product, and therefore, so you've got all these different angles. And fundamentally, the thing, when I land, the thing that's going to get me most is the structure of that landing page experience and the way that the content and the copy pulls me into the journey further. So I fundamentally agree. However, if my interaction with that page is an absolute arse because I've gone
the people design have gone all creative and amazing video and everywhere, but actually, you know, where do I go? Like, what am I meant to do? I want to find this info out, or you don't have it, or how do I get to the product? Oh, you haven't thought through that journey properly. The two are, you shouldn't compromise the former with the latter. But when you're executing that creatively, you need UX UI specialists to go, right, okay, this is how you've got to make it build in mobile into desktop. And you're going to have to lose this to make this functionally coherent and also performant, so that it doesn't create a ridiculously slow and awful page load. So I think the UX UI bit comes after the creative treatment.
Yeah, I completely agree, to be fair. And I think we're both saying the same thing. I think it's more when you go into some processes and like the only real goal is like, we need to improve conversion rate overall as a global thing, rather than thinking about new customers, all these audiences over here, and we need to make it easier to purchase. And I do think that's still really common. There's something else I was going to say then, but I've forgotten it, to be fair. I think, oh yeah, that was it. I was going to say, obviously some people would counter this. So one of the things we talked about before, and earlier you mentioned Palace. Historically on the podcast, we talked about Supreme, and, you know, we've worked with like Dover Street Market and Stussy in the past. There are some businesses that actually intentionally create friction. And we worked with very, very, very high-end luxury brand ones. And they were like, you know, we don't want people to really know how to check out. And like, they didn't really have any substance behind it. It's just that they want to be unique and they want their customers to kind of, you know, work to purchase, etc. And I think that's something I probably disagree with. I get it from a brand perspective, but I think some brands take that a bit far, personally.
I do. And herein lies the beauty of coming back to the point about what metrics are you measuring success against? Because at the end of the day, if a brand doesn't care about people transacting and buying online, they're really not bothered. They just want to create the most insane creative experience. Fair play. That's their decision, their prerogative. I think it's mental as well. And I'd never advocate that to anybody. However, I do understand the friction, because you do have the whole thing of buyer's remorse. If you just push people so quickly into a product decision that they end up regretting, we know it can translate to high returns, and we know it can translate into a drop off and repeat purchases. So you've got to have that balance between product education, discovery, and the enjoyment bit of buying people into the brand, the product, the process before you push it, but also make the product purchase journey so simple for those who are ready to buy. This is what the functional coherence for me is. I can land on the PDP and have an amazing storytelling PDP, and you see this in things like AV equipment, right? Like the high-end like headphones, beautiful product pages. But actually, you know what? The add to basket is pinned. I can buy it. If I'm ready and I've already done my discovery, I'm ready, I can buy it. I don't need to read and look at all the videos. But equally, if I want that experience, I can. So that to me is what functional coherence is. It's taking your point about the different audiences and where they're coming from, and building a page that doesn't slow down a high intent purchaser, but gives those who need education more. And I think people like Palace are actually quite smart, because their friction is done before you're ready to buy. So turning the site off, so you can't get into the shop until the new, like X weeks before the new drop comes in, and they build up the hype in social. Then everyone's excited, and I want to get in the shop. Then it opens, bam. Then you've got a page where actually what would normally be a like PLP is now a visual list like this. And there's loads of sold out things, because then you're creating the fear of missing out. So they're tapping into the psychological principles, because they know that people are so bought into that brand. They want something from the new range. And then when you get in the product page, it's just really cool and irreverent copy, but actually it's easy to buy the product.
Yeah. I think that's always an interesting one. I've had a few discussions with some of our clients about that love the whole turning the site off piece. But it is obviously very hard to measure unless you kind of split test it. But yeah, that's an interesting one.
Imagine telling that to a mass market department store. Just let your site off for 2 weeks.
I know. Now, how see a simple brand do it that I wouldn't expect to do it, actually, and, you know, still kind of think it's the right thing to do. I think this, just because you're sharing the serverless bill insight, I think this is an interesting one as well. So they're a bit quirky with navigation, and we've copied this with a few sites. So this is the all page. So they have a shop all page, and essentially it's just, you know, a wall of product. And I really like it. I think it's just a bit more of a creative way to essentially show your catalog if someone's kind of expressed that they want to see all products. And on mobile, it's really nice as well. I think it's rows of like 4 or 5 on mobile. And then if you go up to the top, the latest is the same. So this has got a vertical scroll, and then on mobile it's horizontal. And it's just, again, just a bit more engaging, quite a nice way to browse the catalog. You obviously wouldn't necessarily want this. I mean, you definitely wouldn't want this site wide. You'd probably only want it on certain, for kind of certain experiences, but I think it's really nice. And I personally really like when brands and sites kind of just invest a bit more in uniqueness in places.
Yeah, and it's interesting how many fashion brands are going through. Money Clothing is another one, very much more basic pages. It's all about the product. It's visual. And I think I do understand that when you're when your audience is very much, it's all visual, that when you're building a brand and quite a niche audience and they're buying based on the look of the product, they're not thinking, should I buy from this brand or not? They're thinking, which items should I buy from the brand? It is interesting. And again, these things are easy to validate and test as well. And I guess people listening is, if you are doing something very different and you're wanting to do something very different, changing it without knowing what the impact is crazy. This is where tests come in, and this is where you should incrementally improve design, and you should fix design issues, elevate your visual, photography, your video content, whatever it might be, your storytelling, your copy. But before fundamentally changing the layout of like a PLP, test the crap out of it. It might just, it might screw your product click-through rates.
I think this leads on nicely to the next podcast that you will be recording when I go off to get married next week with Anya and Nick. So Nick's our head of CRO. I've historically been quite skeptical around CRO, and I still am in a lot of ways. And he and I have debated a lot around this kind of stuff. And I actually think one thing that's happened in the industry recently that's been really positive is, historically, if you want to run CRO, you'd have to go and spend a minimum of 10K a month with an agency that's quite isolated over here. And a lot of the testing would be like volume around kind of smaller tests. Whereas now, via tools like Visually, and as agencies and consultants and whatever else are a bit more comfortable with testing, I think a lot more of our clients are doing like ad hoc testing when it's right to test something. So like a new PDP or a new approach to, upselling in the car. And I think that's something that's also helping this area, and some of the stuff we've discussed, that the barrier to entry to test is much lower.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one, because I'm just going through it with another client at the moment. They are updating their main nav, and they can't test it. They're making changes. They'll measure it through click-through rate, but it would be absolutely great to be able to A/B test that, and do a much more like scientific comparison before and after. Let's get on to the final couple of ones. So design documentation. How important is it? What is good design documentation? What should people have to ensure future consistency?
I mean, I think that's a great question. I don't know. I don't feel like I'm the right person to answer that, or like we're maybe the right people to answer that. I think it's really interesting, some of the tools that people are using nowadays, and some of like the little Figma add-ons and all of that kind of stuff. And I think, there's a lot more kind of technical designers out there as well. And there's a lot more kind of work being done around like design pattern prototyping and everything else. But yeah, I feel like for me, going into a redesign, I think the higher level documentation, I think, like you said earlier, the more data you can have around the customer and the product and the business, the better, as like a foundational thing. I then think it's a case of basically using documentation to collect as much insight from the different stakeholders around what they're trying to achieve and what's important to them as possible. And then I think if you're working with a designer or an agency or whatever, just like, I guess, just making sure that the documentation gives them like freedom, but within a set of parameters and with all that other stuff I just said. But yeah, I feel like I mean, we've done podcasts with Ed and Anton before, but it would be good to have maybe, like, I actually think a really interesting podcast with like a modern kind of full stack creative person would be really interesting, because I find all the stuff that's happening within Figma at the moment, and and even like Figma to front end, like some of the stuff that's been built around that, I think is fascinating. So I think that would be a really good podcast.
Yeah, I agree. And that's what I was thinking of, because there is traditional documentation, which is brand guidelines, which is normally like a massive PDF. But actually the more modern approach is to have things in repositories where you could have annotated files, where the linked assets that can then be downloaded. And I think that's where I see it heading as well, is it's more fluid, because design moves, it's not rigid. And if you have a PDF, it's a pain in the arse to have to then go and recreate it. What version you want? Has everyone got the right versions? So yeah, having a succinct online repository where people can access it and it's locked down for who controls the edits versus who can like access assets is really important. Although I know we could probably talk for hours more on this, because it is, despite the fact that I think you can be very objective about defining good design, as long as you get everyone to buy into the definition that you're using, there is inevitable subjectivity to this. So I really enjoy this. I'd love to hear from people listening. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Like, to you, what is good design? Which sites are well designed and do you like, and why do you like them? Love to hear. Do reach out to Paul and I when we put the post on LinkedIn. I'd love you to add via the comments, because there's no right answer on this. Any closing comments, Paul, for our wonderful listeners?
I don't think so. I think there's a few follow-up topics we could cover for sure that we should plan it, but no, I don't think so.
Cool. Well, look, thanks for listening, everyone. Hope it was useful. Until next week.
You're listening to the Inside Commerce podcast, hosted by experienced consultants James Gurd and Paul Rogers. Inside Commerce is your fast track to digital knowledge, featuring interviews with leading e-commerce retailers, industry thought leaders, and the C-suite of key tech companies to explore the latest in digital strategy, customer experience, and tech. Discover what the latest trends really mean and get practical advice based on experience to help fine-tune your e-com strategy and tech stack. Follow us on LinkedIn and reach out to James or Paul if you'd like to discuss an e-commerce project. We hope you enjoy the latest episode.